Welcome to session 41. We have so far covered the entire opening paragraph of Tao Te Ching. What I would like to point out though here is there are various different versions of Tao Te Ching, I guess sorted, recorded by different scholars. And they came out in different I guess you see the variations, not only the way in contemporary Chinese people break up the words into sentences and paragraphs, even the some of the Chinese characters they put there become different. So apparently, if you break up the sentence differently, you get the totally different meaning for classical Chinese literature or philosophy, so recorded. But as for myself, the interpretation and translation I gave you from classical Chinese, uh, I believe I took a systematic approach, basically uh, in consistency, in comprehension, of course, to my best, I guess, effort, uh, best knowledge, to understand the way of thinking of Taoist teachings rather than just try to figure out a couple of Chinese characters here and there. And of course, that I personally believe that could lead you to some very, I guess, undesired paths for such studies. So anyway, I just needed to get that I guess out of the way. So if you compare my own interpretation and translation to the others of I guess other versions out there in Chinese or English, they could be different. And I'm not going to say mine is the right one, the others are not, or vice versa. But I guess this is not something you just totally copy and paste in this, spoon feeding kind of thing. Um, it does require your own uh, taking in, but then try to digest with your own life experience and your readings of all different kinds, and then to make the most sense out of it. Once again, my interpretation and translation here is offered as a sharing. It's not a teaching because I don't consider myself, or actually anybody today for that matter, qualifies to be a teacher. You know, it's just how we study, how we feel about, what we learned, and we share. And hopefully one day, some kind of exchange, of views in between, whoever in a invisible online club of this book study, right? So let's get back to the last sentence of the opening paragraph, which is basically talking about when you try to, I guess, discover the truth. There are a lot of things, I mentioned about, in the Chinese analogy, four blind people, basically, they were led to be, I guess, to be introduced to elephant. They couldn't see, so they feel with their hands. So that was a good intention to introduce, elephant, the physical presence to the people who lost their sight. So the, I guess, sensors for them available or accessible or basically, hand feeling. So one on the trunk, one on the elephant ear, and one on the tail, and one on the legs, and of course feet. Um, of course, when they feel, they get different shape and size. That gives them the impression, right? So when one claim based on the feel of the tail, you know, really contradict the one who got the hands on the trunk, and then of course the one on the ear, and of course the one on the leg, each and a single one of the four, they were partially right for the part they came into contact and so described and defined what elephant is. The problem was none of them could, basically get all of the whole thing and to come up with their conclusion on that. So, which is pretty much, like our cognition system of humankind today. We observe the natural phenomenon of, Mother Nature, and, lots of time we tend to believe we've got the whole truth, nothing but the truth. So we have the definition, but because this is only partial truth, if it is truth at all, um, as a partial truth, of course, it's tend to be corrected in time, right? So there are those, fact finding, which we don't know if the scope actually cover the entire thing. But if you consider how huge Mother Nature is, I seriously doubt we could ever come up with a definition on something specific that covered the full whole, the full scope, right? Because when you see the things constantly develop, in form of change, there's always a trend, right, of the development of the situation. When you segment one part of the whole process of such change, you define that part, that segment. That could be, precise all by itself, but it cannot cover the stages of changes, in process that is outside, falls outside your sight. There's no way you can do that, right? So this is why, for us to observe anything, you gotta bear in your mind that it's gonna change, it's gonna evolve, it's gonna develop, right? And if we let the definition of any specific segment, the moment, I guess, momentary truth, stay here for too long, becomes the box that confine our thought, our way of thinking, and impact on, our observations for further changes. That could be quite misleading, because then we basically just stick to the same fact that we found as we perceived as the truth we discovered, and let it basically just extend all the way. Of course, then it's just like those blind people, came to believe the certain shape and the size of an elephant. I guess, in fairness' sake, it would be a lot more difficult for the people with the side, to come have I guess, somewhat more reasonable assessment of the size and the guesstimate of the weight of an elephant, right? So we do have the, as mentioned in the opening paragraph in previous sentences of Dao De Jing, we do have the way of measuring the changes over the course consistently, so that we can identify the trend. So I personally believe the essence of Taoist teaching is to become adaptive in the way of thinking, and that will lead you to the long-term strategy with the consideration of all these changes that being observed with the measurement means, and so that the historical trend is identified so that you can adapt to what? To the trend. Because you see where the development is going in what direction. So the decisions you make to adapt this trend, ended up in actions or inactions appropriate, you know, in alignment with the long-term strategy. Nevertheless, adapt to the development trend, right? This way, you see several steps ahead, saving yourself from constantly reacting with this action, that action, and each action basically just produce new causes for more reactive actions and just constantly having to respond to all these, incidents on surface, right? So this is pretty much the ending sentence about, the whole adaptive, the rationale of why, and somehow the hint on the methodologies of how, uh, being a Taoist, how do you, uh, I guess, develop your somewhat more proper angle of observation so that you could develop the adequate, longer term strategy with the bigger picture that, from the broader view. And that's the whole opening paragraph is all about, to my best understanding. And so I share here with you guys. A lot of time, we feel about things that we believe is the truth. And other times we basically, study both with qualitative and quantitative, means that I mentioned earlier, and pretty scientifically, try to, scope something and then define it, and let it fall into the scope of academics, and then education institutions teach the people, and the people, take that away, when they graduate, walking out of the programs, and let it become the box, to confine themselves when it comes to thinking. Of course, we need disruptions from time to time to break all that so that we could go on. And I guess the way to discover the whole truth, not just segmented, the momentary truth. And that's what, why we need disruptions, right? And then on the other hand, what do we feel and how we feel? A lot of times is very important, right? Because we got the CDC experts telling us this and that. We got the WHO or WHA, whatever, the experts with the established credential and reputation that we are to respect their opinions, as experts rather than, our own little figuring, right? But then in the meantime, there's always the culture and the subculture of the people. People are not robots, right? They have their certain feelings. So once the quarantine, the lockdown, goes beyond 2 weeks, people start to have their feelings, right? Especially certain, people of certain culture. I mean, here in Houston, take a walk in the street or in the shops, grocery stores. You will see certain, I'm not going to be very specific, but I have observed repeatedly certain group of people walking in the streets or inside grocery stores. They don't, not all of them, at least I would say, at least 40% of them that I saw do not wear masks. The city of Houston required people to do that, but they don't, right? And then there are other places, not in Houston, but some other places. There are a lot of people, going out there to celebrate the end of the entire quarantine or lockdown, and they're breaking the regulations. They're violating the regulations of social distance, and of course, they bear the result. And we can see the stats that the trend of breakout, instead of coming down after all this time, is going back up, right? Compared to before the relaxing of the quarantine or the lockdown. Does that tell anybody anything statistically? I'm sure it does. But then, people feel, and you cannot deny people do feel, do I really want to be like confined to the four walls of my little home, and do not go out? What is the meaning of my life? And I have my constitutional right to be an American. That is, obviously the rationale of certain thinkings. But then there are other people who are angry about, this kind of behavior. It's like, hey, you can't just be thinking about yourself. If you do this, and the stats are already indicating that trend, if you do this, as you do, what about the rest of people when you come in contact with other people? Sure, the American law, traditionally, if you're flying your own personal little aircraft, you want to, die, it's okay. If that's your choice, just so document that's how you want. But you don't have the same right for the passenger in your little, personal aircraft. By the same token, if you're a motorcycle, rider, you have to legally document your will that you're not wearing the helmet. If you die, you die. But once again, you cannot have that applying to the passenger sitting behind you. Okay, that passenger would have to wear the helmet. Why? The whole notion of this uniquely American thing is, hey, you want to end your own life the way you choose, the way you desire? That's constitutional right. Okay, you have the right to end your own life any way you want, I guess. I don't know if that's true, or even religiously, are you really trying to end your own life, to take your own life, or you're just taking the risk of it? And that's all very, I guess, moral, ethics, religious, a lot of factors to I guess contribute, right? But that's an American tradition. So now, if you feel so strongly against being confined to the four walls of your own little establishment, residence, whatever, are you entitled to go out? I don't know. Because if the quarantine thing is still on, then legally you're not supposed to go out, right? But let's say it's relaxed. You can go out legally. You are entitled to, and you're free to. But what about the social distance, right? That requirement, that's still in effect. And you totally ignore that. Okay. And then you go visit your friend and you visit your family, right? You don't know what you're carrying, and you pass on to them. And then, they became somewhat clinical case, which may or may not leading to death. How would you think about that, right? Now we're talking about culture, because if you look at the East Asian countries today, well, some quarantine may not be, forced upon them, and they'll follow. Is it just East Asian countries? For most part of Germany, from what I heard, people follow. If the government recommend them to do so, they do it. Of course, do they have demonstration? They do. there's also, a group feels so strongly against it too. But back to the East Asian countries, why do you think the people, you know, obey this? It doesn't have to be law. It's just the, recommendations or requirements by, the authorities, and they all obey. Why is that? Because you can't just be thinking about yourself. You have to think about, your loved ones. If you carry this virus, but there's no breakout on you, when that passes on to your parents, somewhat, of course, older than you, um, what would be the result of that? Or your little ones? Be considerate. And that's the culture, in the East Asian countries, which I mentioned, what make the East Asian countries different from the rest of the Asian, or let alone the world, is the Confucianism, which is basically, at core, filial piety, right? Now, with all that, what I try to say here is there are things that's defined, in fact, regulated, by law. And there's things you actually just feel. And the two things, they kind of, sometimes work with each other, sometimes they work against each other. At the end of the day, you cannot just, believe that either one is the truth, the whole truth, nothing but the truth. You don't know that, okay? So you always constantly weigh, between these two. And of course, it'd be nice they, always overlap or even, become the same. That'd be great. But what really is, I guess at the point here is you don't just get stuck with the segmented or momentary truths, specifically defined over certain things of certain scope, at the certain time, because you always have to get above and beyond for the bigger picture, so that you actually getting at least a couple of steps closer to the whole truth, right? Comparing to otherwise the momentary segmented truth of the time of certain scope as defined. So that's this session. Until next one, ciao.